Hello, everyone, and welcome to WiscWeb's July Lunch and Learn. I am Jenna Klinner. I'm the service coordinator for the WiscWeb team, and I'm joined here today by several members of the team, as well as Al from the Center of User Experience. Hello, Al. We have I guess, light agenda in terms of topics today. First, I'll just run through a couple updates and reminders for you all, and then we're going to be spending the majority of our time chatting about the digital accessibility policy with Al, um, who's going to give the overview, and we're going to have ample time for Q&A today. So first, we just have updates and reminders for July. As a reminder, Google Analytics 4 has fully replaced Universal Analytics. We encourage you to join the Google Analytics Practitioners Group in Teams if you have any questions around Google Analytics 4. A little sister service update for you. The Knowledge Base team is hosting their annual user group meeting from July 29th to August 2nd this year. It's a great opportunity to learn more about the Knowledge Base and get helpful tips and insights on how to use their amazing tool. And finally, another reminder to please update your site to denote a primary contact if you can. That information is really helpful for us as we reach out to you all for different things on your site. Then we know who can make decisions and who is the best person to connect with about those changes. And that's all we have for updates and reminders today. And I'll hand things over to Al to chat about the digital accessibility policy. And I'll also stop sharing my screen here.
Sounds good. Thank you, Jenna. And I will share my screen and get some slides up here. So bear with me for just a moment. I am hopeful that, there we go. And let me know, can everyone see those okay?
I can, yes.
Okay. All
Looks
right.
good.
Excellent. Well, we'll jump into things here and kind of go from here. I do plan on spending, maybe a good 20 to 30 minutes at least here, kind of giving you some basic information, but I wanted to leave plenty of time for some Q&A just for folks. There's a lot to kind of go through. And I imagine a lot of you may have questions based on the information I brought to share today. So for those that that have questions in the middle, if you can hold them to the end, great. If there's something that's just a burning question, definitely throw it in chat. Or at least Jen may be able to pop in here and help interrupt if there's something that's
Absolutely.
extremely contextual. So
Yes, I will let you
yeah,
know.
perfect. Great. Well, the photo's a little bit redundant since we're on camera, but anyway, I'll just introduce myself. My name is Al Nemec. I am the Digital Accessibility Program Manager at the Center for User Experience here in DoIT. For those that may know me, I have been on campus for almost a little over 12 years now. I was not originally with DoIT, though. I had spent the previous about 11 with the College of Agricultural and Life Sciences as the web operations manager and a developer before that. So I've only been in my role here at the Center for User Experience for about 6 months. But I've been engaged with digital accessibility in a myriad of roles throughout both my time here at the UW-Madison as well as in previous occupations I've had, in particular in the private sector. So I kind of go back about 17, 18 years in terms of my work there. So let me talk a little bit about policy side of things, and we'll kind of get into sort of what all this is and what does it mean and some of the changes that have been happening. So with that in mind, the digital accessibility policy, in some ways, there's been one on this campus for quite some time. There's a new one, but there has been a policy based on 508 standards that has been around since even in some ways since based on both the federal and state regulations even since the 90s. The previous one I think was in 2001. That was the official UW policy, but the current policy as of now is one that was effectively applied on July 1st, 2023. This new policy is there to really kind of bring up the standards of digital accessibility that we've had on this campus. And I think most folks have really been, in many ways, already applying, but making sure that the policy is in alignment with that. So the policy in of itself basically is taking on a couple of new specific items that talk about what we're doing in digital accessibility and applying that to the WCAG 2.1 guidelines, as well as just anything that would be affected in multimedia or other forms of digital accessibility as well. So we'll get in there and that sort of thing. But the biggest thing that I think that I want to kind of talk about here before I dive into too many specifics is there are a lot of things that go into making anything accessible. And the reality of this is that there's not, even though I might be working on this as sort of a primary role, and I feel lucky to be able to do that. This is something that all of us need to be able to do. We all have to engage with digital accessibility. We're all making new things all the time, right? And given that we're in a more, continuing our sort of work in technology as time goes on, and even as things have, I think, really accelerated with COVID into a hybrid environment, almost everything we make now is digital. So everything we're doing these days in terms of making documents, multimedia, websites, Canvas courses, that sort of thing, all these things are in that sort of umbrella of digital accessibility things we need to be mindful of. So to kind of go through how the overall implementation of this policy is sort of happening. Some of you may already be in this audience, may already be familiar with the policy implementation plan as it had been originated. And this was the plan that was published within the policy library as of July of 2023. But there is now a recent update to this plan. So I want to be able to cover a little bit of the details there and tell you about the what the changes are and the why. So for the most part, for those that are familiar, again, that have been involved in this, you may know that document accessibility has been the focus for this first year. So from July 1, 2023 to July 1, 2024, really the focus was all about documents. And this document accessibility phase was really a great opportunity to sort of spend as much of our time devoting resources, focusing on the outreach and conversation topics, and helping folks just sort of have a general reminder to try to focus on some of those things. The important thing, though, is that we want folks to know that just because we've hit this first year sort of time span, that document accessibility shouldn't be dropped, right? Document accessibility needs to be a continuation of what we're doing. Really, about a lot of what the policy is doing is trying to change the overall working structure that we all sort of abide by when we go through creating documents, and make sure that we are doing these extra steps to put things in the right light, make sure they're accessible to everybody. So document accessibility information is going to continue to come out. It's going to continue to be available. Resources are going to be made available as time continues to go on. So we'd like to consider these more focus areas than they are phases. So since that time, we are now entering the next phase of things, the next focus area, which is all about websites, web apps, as well as LMS and LTI. Now, for those familiar with the old implementation plan, the original plan was that this next only single year was going to be about LMS and LTI, most notably Canvas on this campus. But instead, we're really looking at things, and we wanted to switch things up based on a lot of things we've learned. So looking at how things went with the document accessibility focus state for that year changed a lot of our thinking on this, as well as a lot of coordination with other institutions, both at UW-Madison, both within other UW system schools, as well as the Big Ten. And hearing about how all those different phases went changed up a little bit of our approach moving forward. So some of that approach includes, now that we're going to look at the next 2 years. So this next 2-year phase is continuing to be LMS, but it's also including websites and web applications. So the intention here is that this is an opportunity for us to try to make sure that we have as many resources available for folks that are looking at how do they make these different areas more accessible. And it also is a shift in exactly how we're going to be able to try to deliver these resources in a way that's maybe more effective. The thing that comes up, I think, a lot, though, when we're talking about websites and LMS that is kind of important to note is that really these things aren't working in a vacuum, right? Everything related to these categories includes some aspect of documents. You call back to linked documents, multimedia, and even other resources beyond that. So there's a lot of things where the other implementation plan phases that were considered to be separate entire phases are areas that we're looking at trying to bake more into this next 2-year phase as much as possible. So we'll go into that.
Al,
So
there is a question in the chat that I'll ask real quick.
Go for it.
Is this primarily following the W3C, WAI Web Accessibility Initiative, and then customized for WiscWeb and Canvas, is the question.
Yes, so it is following we're specifically looking at compliance within the WCAG 2.1. So it is in that space within the W3C. This is the actual intention with the next focus area is that we can try to devote as much resource to specifically customize for Canvas as well as for WiscWeb and anyone else that may be developing any other web resources. So the intention is we are working with everyone that we can, including WiscWeb, to make sure that what is being developed and what moving forward with is being made in the most accessible way possible. One of the big benefits of if you're utilizing the WiscWeb service right now and you have a WiscWeb site is that you're already in a really great position. So everything that you've been developing and are working with right now already puts you in a really, really great spot. The thing about a lot of the work that comes into making a lot of these materials accessible, at least some of the default that you get out of a managed service is done for you. There's some of the same things that we're looking at with Canvas as well. So as we look at how Canvas rolls out its updates and what we're working with there, there's a couple of things that are sort of, I'd say, in parallel to the web space. So for example, within Canvas, the default Canvas experience in many ways has actually been updated to be pretty accessible. But similar to WordPress plugins, there are LTIs or learning technology integrations that we look at and say, these are some of these need to be revamped. We need to work with the vendors to talk about how those things might be changed or see which things are actually in use and how we want to work with the Learn at UW folks to try to make sure those things are updated, if anything, to make sure they are in compliance with the standard. Hopefully does that help, I hope.
I'm not seeing any follow-ups.
Okay.
Thank you,
I'd
Al.
be happy to get into more. We can definitely get into more detail there. But yeah, I think that there's a general sense that we want to make sure that things are more contextual to everything that everyone is building, so that it's not just a broad, hey, make things accessible. We need to be specific about what are these things you need to be doing. What are the how-tos? What are the getting started steps? Right. So that's part of it, and we'll definitely get into more of that in a little bit here. So a couple of the things I just want to highlight, like why did we do this implementation plan change? I did kind of hint at that a little bit already. We did see that overall there was a lot of learning we did based on the document accessibility side of things. We also learned that overall, in these other institutions, that folks found that the web and specifically both web and LMS both kind of gave a lot more opportunity to learn about how to tackle accessibility and a better way to kind of have better metrics and understand, like, are we making an impact? Are we getting something? Are we getting somewhere with what we're trying to do? We also see it as a good opportunity to say, hey, if you were, a lot of folks we've worked with, not everybody, but some folks are much more focused on one than the other, right? You might be more focused in the web space than you are within Canvas, or vice versa. If you happen to be in both, it doesn't really change the amount of time you get. But if you are focused on one of these, you kind of get an extension of that time too to really see this focus state. You kind of see the more of a 2 years. The other thing is that we wanted more time to develop some of these resources. There's a lot of things that we're working through right now, and I'm going to share those in a little bit that kind of come out to help sort of elevate some of this information and hopefully make it more approachable for everyone to kind of understand what they can be doing and what they should be doing. And the last thing, and I will definitely cover this more as well today, is there are new federal regulations that kind of go with all of this. So, I've sort of mentioned how in general there's always been a general accessibility guideline that's been basically out there. There was a recent Department of Justice ruling to Title II changes that came out since April that accelerates that a little bit. And we see this as an opportunity to apply this to the policy. UW-Madison's in a uniquely good position to be able to meet this new regulation because we already have a policy. Not everyone has that. We also happen to have a lot of things already in place. So we're in a really good position for that, but it's important to be mindful of that and how we adjust to make sure that we meet that standard. So I mentioned the additional time for websites in Canvas. That's a big part of that as well. A number of things that come up with this is that there are a lot of websites on campus. I'm sure most of you may be aware, but I mean, WiscWeb has a ton, and no surprise there. But there's a lot of other platforms on campus, at least special groups that have produced things that are specific maybe to their unit that they needed. There's additional work that's going on in other spaces. So it's really important to know that there's a large volume of work here. There's also thousands of new course content pages that are generated every year. And every new semester, we're seeing a lot of new content coming from instructors and instructional designers that needs to be addressed. So in combination with what the center is doing, we're also working with, of course, the McBurney Disability Resource Center and others to try to make sure that we are doing things in a way that is sustainable based on the resources that we have. Given that there's a variety of different site designs and purposes and content, there's a lot that goes into that. And of course, folks that are developing custom applications need to be mindful of this as well. So all this extra time is hopefully to make sure that we have enough resources and enough both in sort of asynchronous learning as well as direct support that we can extend to those folks. So I want to kind of cover like what are some of these development resources that I've talked about now. It's sort of like there's a hope that there's more coming, right? But there's, you know, what are we trying to do here? So for the most part, there's a couple of things that we're going to dive into. So number one is that the Make It Accessible guides that you may or may not be familiar with already. Those are on the it.wisc site. Those have been out there for some time. However, they are definitely need for an update. So we are actually about a couple of weeks away from publishing a brand new set of Make It Accessible guides. Those will be coming soon. They'll be available later this summer, and those will provide a new structure for how folks can focus on the different areas of the policy. They are aligned with both content areas and the policy areas, so that if you're learning what you can be doing more within how you're developing your documents or what you're doing on a website, that's going to include a lot of great referential information and general guides on what you should be doing. The other thing is we'll be extending our office hours. So I'm not sure how many of you may all be familiar with the liaison program. I'll talk about that in a moment. But that is, we are looking at extending that resource out to much more of campus so that folks that have direct questions about something that's specific that they're encountering and they need to understand more about what they can do, that's something that we'll be extending that soon as well. We will also be adding additional welcome sessions. And for those that are not yet familiar with it, the community of practice as well is out there. And I highly recommend getting engaged in that space as well. It's a really good place to learn a lot from a lot of the folks that are on this campus that deal with a lot of different areas. The community of practice, so I have a few links later in the slides and we can include those in the chat. But those spaces will really offer a good opportunity to sort of learn a little bit more about what you can be doing in these spaces. The last thing is we want to make sure we're, you know, coordinating with the campus partners. So talking more with every unit, every office that's maybe managing a platform, and further is talking about how we can make sure that things are done right, sort of in sort of the highest level, so that we don't have anybody feeling like there's as big of a burden on your individual day-to-day work. We want to make sure that as much of that is addressed as possible.
Al,
So
sorry.
yes,
We
go
have
ahead.
another question in the chat.
Yeah.
So James asks, will the resources and guides also provide strategies/tactics for dynamic content like data visualizations in Tableau and Power BI? BL? I'm
Great
not sure.
question. Yeah. And also reminds me of I don't know how many of you may be using Power BI. I've been learning a little bit more about that recently. I saw that Google has its own product, which I think is a terrible name. It's called Google Looker Studio. Anyway, either way, terrible name for that one. But the general idea is we don't have anything specific yet related to data visualizations. That is something that this is the kind of thing that, by the way, I think feedback that any of you have like that in terms of specifics you would be looking for, those are excellent to hear about. The number one thing we're trying to do within the Make It Accessible guides is not recreate the wheel. So if we find out that there is an already existing resource on exactly what is the best way to make accessible content both within a particular medium, in this case, you know, maybe data visualizations there, we want to hear about it, because we're going to be doing as much investigation as we can as to whether or not that resource already exists, making sure we can then link it within the Make It Accessible guides so that it's referential for everybody. And if there is nothing there, we are going to do the due diligence to get some answers. We want to get answers for all of you so you know what to be doing there. So that's a great one. I'm going to make a note of that here. So I don't know if there's additional questions. Otherwise, I will
Nope.
keep jumping in
James
here.
just said thank you for that answer.
No, excellent. That's great. So meeting the new federal regulations is sort of the next big one here. And this is one that I think some of you may have heard about, some of you may not. And I just want to kind of highlight this just because it's really something that's important to mention, that because it can sound, I think, sound a little scarier than it is. So first, I'll do a quick sort of recap here, and sort of talk about things that, you know, I kind of mentioned off the top some light things, but in general, there's been a long history with ADA and digital accessibility. There's been a lot that has went through both state and local governments, as you see in the early 2000s. And there's been the Office of Civil Rights investigations that occur really across all of the country, has been a part of also the work that we've been seeing and doing here on this campus for some time. We have worked with the Office of Civil Rights in the past to make sure that things are accessible, and it's nice that there's, I think, a good relationship there with everyone on campus, because when we've had to deal with these things in the past, everyone came together and really were able to remedy things so quickly. It was amazing. So the biggest thing that I want to kind of mention as well is that the OCR forms, as it relates to this new regulation, are the thing that we're anticipating. So what it means is that this new regulation requires that within the next 2 years that we are kind of meeting the standard of a WCAG 2.1 AA, which is within that guideline for digital accessibility. As long as we are sort of in that, on the path to meet that or meeting that in certain spaces, that's the best place we can be with a lot of this. So the intention is that, not that we expect everybody to have everything perfect at that point in time. The intention is that we know that there's some awareness, and that if you know that there is something that is going to require a significant amount of resources to deal with, or maybe even isn't really possible, it's better to document that and talk about that and figure out what is the plan longer term. Or maybe if it's talking with a vendor, who wants to reach out to the vendor and understand if we can kind of make sure that request is out there for them to update their materials. These are the kind of things that we want to make sure are on the table, and that we're working through over these next 2 years. The intention for the new rule really is to kind of switch things a little bit. From being sort of reactive to now being proactive. So there's a lot here on the slide. I want to make sure that, Jenna, I think we can maybe make this available for folks afterwards as well, if they'd like to be able to reread through
Yeah,
these or click on some of these
absolutely.
links. There's a
Mhm.
lot of content here, so you don't feel like you have to necessarily go through all this right now. But it's important to be aware of the impact, of course, of digital accessibility. The big thing is that, is when it comes to the regulation in particular, is that a lot of the previous work that we've seen, not just, of course, within Wisconsin, but all over the country, has mostly been a little bit more reactionary. A lot of folks, look at things, for example, like accommodations, and they say, well, isn't that addressing the need? And the reality is that accommodations are there, I think, as sort of a last necessity for folks that really have a unique situation that really benefits from. The intention with the new rule is that we are expected to be accessible from Go, and that we provide that with the default resource. So, for example, if we're going to have people consider like alternative formats, right? So, if we think of a resource, like we're trying to share information about, let's just say, parking, right? We want to have that out there. Transportation Services is working on that. The intention is that the default resource that they point everybody to, that's the one that you want to be accessible. If you have an individual that says, I really need this to be in an alternative format for something that I'm dealing with, providing that on the website would be wonderful. But you don't want to start with, you don't want to by default say, well, we're just going to make alternative formats for everybody. So starting with and making sure that the default format you have is accessible is a really great approach here. And the thing that we often recommend to folks, for example, is to consider the formats of what you're producing. The new rule guidelines here in general, as I've already highlighted, so I won't spend too much time on this, but just want to make note of this again. We're meeting WCAG 2.1. For those that are really following this stuff in close, there is a WCAG 2.2 that is now already published, so we could go for 2.2, but 2.1 is both the policy and the DOJ regulation as it stands right now. So we don't need to go further than that. We will probably look at things in a few years and see if that 2.2 is the next update we may need to make to the policy. So when we look at what are the things that each of you can be doing, and I'll get into some of this with the formats, is we really want everyone to be mindful of what you're doing, what you're working on, is to review your site or sites, inventory what you have, consider what you're publishing, what the formats are. We'll talk about that in a second, as well as wanting to make sure that everyone feels comfortable and is willing to reach out and get more information. The best thing we can do here, and this is the thing that's been part of the liaison network, that for those that may be familiar with it already, is it's really establishing those communication conduits and having that opportunity to reach out to units and learn more about exactly what struggles they're having and what we can do to help. And what we can do to maybe share knowledge back as well. There's an amazing amount of knowledge that's sort of in different distributed parts of this campus. So it's really hard for any one area to sort of know everything they need to do, and we're going to learn as much from you as you might from us. So the biggest thing with when you inventory is I want you to consider things like, well, make sure you're aware of what your content is. And this is probably just general best practices in general, right? Is knowing, do I have pages that I just still say new coming in 2018. I've seen those sites before. I'm not pointing any fingers. I've worked with folks that have had the same thing. But keep in mind what you have out there. Try to pay attention to that and update things. To get rid of content maybe that's no longer relevant. If you don't need it anymore, or if it's not there, please feel free to archive, remove that. Those are things that are, absolutely worthwhile doing. You want to look at some of the Make Accessible how-tos. Those are a good thing to consider referring to. The current Make Accessible guides I have linked right here, but as I mentioned, those will be getting updated very soon. The new format for those guides will include a lot of just sort of best practices at the top. We're going to start off with getting started steps. So everyone can see sort of a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that you should be doing, whether you're looking at websites or documents or email or anything else in between. So that's the intention that'll be having moving forward here, is just trying to give people that quick, give me that answer, let me get back to what I'm doing. So, and the last thing I would recommend, if folks are particularly technical and they're interested in diving into this, you are welcome to consider scanning a page as well. The thing I'd be mindful of here is that you can use tools that are free out there, such as Wave or Lighthouse that's built into Chrome. The important thing, though, is that this can be overwhelming. So if you do this and you see, I don't know what any of this is, don't panic. This is not about trying to understand all the results that those might give you. It's more about just giving you a sense of if you may have some things to pay attention to. And the best thing at that point is to reach back out to, WiscWeb if you're trying to learn more, and you can reach out to the center as well. So all of this is about just learning a little bit more about where those gaps are. The other thing you might want to consider doing as you're working through your content is, especially in WordPress in particular, go to that media library. Definitely take a look at all the media items you have. The number one thing that we've seen that comes up at least time and time again is folks that will forget about a few media items. It's very common, especially if you're working really fast and to get things out the door. Making sure you can apply some alternative text. Now, WordPress gives you a number of other fields. They give you title, they give you description. The number one thing that usually default to is at least the alternative text. You don't have to fill in all of those fields unless you really prefer to. And Jenna, feel free to counter that if you'd like folks to fill in everything. But at least for as far as the accessibility side of things is concerned, usually the alternative text is the number one thing in particular. Make sure you structure your content as well. So, these are just good fundamentals. And we're going to have, by the way, a fundamentals guide with a downloadable link within the new Make It Accessible guides coming soon as well. The intention there is that you want to make sure that you're, don't use just a bolded large piece of text when it maybe should be a heading, right? And if you use a heading, pick the right heading structure. If you start with, maybe have an H2, the one after that, if it's a substructure of that, to be H3. So just following those basic steps helps a lot, because when someone is engaging with your content, depending on what sort of assistive technology they may be using, and that may be a screen reader, that may be a dictation software, oftentimes they rely on what's called the rotor, which is basically the interface that they might engage with, and they're looking at things like heading structure and link structure, and it lets them jump around the page really fast. It's incredibly amazing to see someone who engages with these technologies all the time, because they are amazingly fast at them, as long as those sort of landmarks of the page are there. So that's a big thing to be considering. And a lot of the default landmarks that we look for that are sort of the overarching ones are provided by way of the UW theme. So you get a lot of, again, those good defaults there by being in that space already. Make sure you choose accessible formats. So if you have something that you're providing, let's say as a PDF, I'm going to call out PDF because PDF is usually the biggest problem area we see. An Adobe PDF is basically going to be oftentimes the least accessible, just because by default, most publishing, whether you're doing it through InDesign or Illustrator or some other format, can sometimes miss a lot of those things. The tagging that needs to be done usually for an Adobe PDF to make sure it is accessible, as well as the content order. So, when you're laying something on InDesign, your content order, your layer order may not match what the content order is, but that layer order is in some ways what gets leveraged for content order by default when you export. Thankfully, there's a couple of things you can do, and we are going to actually have some direct guides. So this goes a little bit back to that Power BI question. In some ways, we are going to have some direct instructions that we will provide and link to within the new guides coming soon regarding using some of the tools like Adobe InDesign. So that'll help with understanding a little bit more of which button should I be clicking, which checkbox should I check on that export to help get the best thing I can for you. But when you are thinking of PDF, don't forget that maybe this can just be natively on the web. And sometimes that version of itself helps even more, because you're going to get also not only going to get a little bit more accessibility out of being native to the web, you're also going to get some benefits because you're going to be mobile responsive now, and you're going to have a few other things as well. So keep that in mind whenever you're producing materials. And don't forget, lastly, to leverage templates. There's a lot of good, the templates themselves, by way of what the UW theme provides, as well as templates for other media. So go to brand.wis.edu, take a look at the different media types they have out there. There's a lot of good pieces that you can leverage there that are going to give you a good sort of head start on doing things in the right way, that sort of take time off, take sort of the burden off of producing something from a blank canvas, and keep that in mind. It can be a good way to kind of go in that space. I wanted to kind of highlight this, so I hope I'm not putting this too much on the spot for you, Jenna, but I want to make sure that folks do reach out to your team anytime that they are looking for, they have questions regarding what they should be doing in that space within the UW theme. You all have the most knowledge and expertise, everything there. So I definitely recommend it. If you are looking at having something evaluated, though, whether that be a website, a piece of media, a specific product or vendor tool, any of those sort of things, the Center for User Experience does these free evaluations. So we can basically have our team go through things, and we will often apply things both not only with automated scanners, but we'll do a manual check with assistive technologies to see what we can find that may be missing or can be adjusted to improve that particular resource. So please feel free to engage with us there. You can fill out our contact form. And lastly, the community of practice, which I would also recommend getting in touch with. There is a Teams channel for that group, and you can chat with the other 400 folks that are on there and ask questions and be like, well, I'm looking at doing this. What have all of you tried to do to solve this problem? And that can be super helpful. There's a lot of things that get really unique and nuanced with all the different work that goes on. So it's really hard to provide general solutions to all these specific problems. So I kind of want to pause here and kind of leave some open for some questions. But I will say that there's a lot that I kind of ran through and rambled through really quick. I want to make sure that folks know that there's a lot that we have available for resources that we're working through, and that we're going to have more coming soon. So my hope is that we, within either the community of practice space, and we can make sure that this is published back to you, Jenna, to share with the team and share with the rest of the group. About any learning opportunities, webinars, external speakers, things like that as well. So with that, I guess we'll pause here and see maybe what questions anyone might have.
Yeah, we have a question in the chat. Do you have recommendations for a free WCAG validation tool?
Yes. So there's a couple of different things you can do. In particular, Lighthouse is a good option for those that I can actually show this on my screen a little bit if folks would like to see maybe how these work. I'll stop. Oh, I stopped the presentation, but I stopped share. Let me reshare the screen. All right. So let me jump in here. There we go. All right. So there's a couple of things you can do if you're just trying to get a sense of if you're looking at what's the comparison of what the page I have is against WCAG 2.1. By default, the Wave engine does use that standard, as well as the Lighthouse tool that Google Chrome has built into it as well. So you can particularly leverage these. Keep in mind, again, the information you might get out of these can be a little bit more detailed. So if I were to provide a scan, for example, it's going to be very general, but it's going to give you a sense of exactly what it's seeing in terms of landmarks. It's going to give you a sense of what it's seeing for content order, for ARIA labels as well. And again, we're getting a little bit into the weeds here on some of those pieces, but it does provide you, at least right off the top, a sense of, are there any errors? So what's really important here is that, you get a lot of great benefits out of what's going to come out of the Udemy theme already. It takes care of a lot of the needs that there are around the content, but it is possible when you're writing content to do things that might get flagged as an error here. And it's not something to be overly concerned about. And the nice thing is that once you do see something here, you can actually see the details and you can click on it and it'll highlight what on the page it is. So it might spot for you, oh, I didn't make that a heading. I made that just bolded text. So that's something you can consider to look at as well, if that doesn't feel overwhelming to do. The other thing you can look at as well is there's a tool, again, built right into Chrome called Lighthouse. It does something similar. There's a lot of different tools that are out there these days, and the tool landscape has changed dramatically. So, for example, the Wave engine is one in particular built by WebAIM. There's a couple of enterprise tools that the Center for User Experience is considering right now to see whether or not they are available for us to procure for campus or not. But the benefit is of having these free tools that are based on it means that you can actually leverage the free tools now. And even if later on there's an enterprise tool, there's an opportunity to kind of go back and see, okay, great. These data points are, they're corresponding. We can actually look at both of them and consider them. So this tool as well gives you a little highlight. about what you might see and find. And again, this is great for websites. Documents, things vary a little bit. So I can talk about that a little bit. And this is why documents is a little bit of a fuzzy one. But again, if you see something in here, if you're not perfect 100%, it does not need to be 100%. It's more about just the working towards trying to catch these little pieces that might be missing. It's sort of like catching broken links. Every now and then there's going to be one. Accessibility is not a yes or no answer. It's always sort of a work in progress. So there's nothing that's expected to sort of get to a certain mark, more so that there's just more of a general awareness of what things can be fixed. And who knows, you might come across a page that was published 4 years ago and you just haven't retouched it since then. And this gives you an opportunity to see what you can make for little improvements. The document side of things, there's a lot you can do in different tools, but there's not a singular tool that's going to test all documents. So for example, Adobe Acrobat actually has built into it an accessibility checker. That accessibility checker will go through your document and let you know what it's finding. Oftentimes, it's going to flag some general basics. That's going to include not setting a global language. It's going to include not setting tagging or not having done tagging yet. And it gives you some links and opportunities to make an actual change there to actually apply tagging. So it does help. I will warn that tool can also be a little bit daunting at first. So if you get into that space and you're thinking this is more than I can handle, I'd say not to worry about it. The better thing to do is to consider what formats you're producing the PDF from. So again, if you're thinking about it coming from InDesign, or maybe it's coming from Google Docs or from Word, the most important thing is that whatever that source format is, because most people I think don't produce Adobe PDFs in Acrobat from scratch, is just to use the right heading structure. So if you're making a Google Doc, make sure you're using a title attribute right at the top. That title attribute, you notice when you're making a Google Doc, and if I were to go and actually set one up really quick, if I go to make a blank document here, there's a couple of things, for example, right off the bat that you might think is, well, I can make a page title or document title, and you might leave it as normal text to make it big. That's not really helping all the other pieces that might need to be identified. Just for a quick example, the biggest thing you can do, for example, is start to leverage this format structure you have under here. So make sure you do have a title. This title is actually setting a meta value inside Google Docs as well that's defining the document title to other formats. So that's really important, because you might not seem like that's the big deal here because it just made the text a little bit bigger for you, but otherwise isn't evidentiary to what else might be happening. When you go to export this for PDF or for Word or for anything else, it's setting all those other meta values in those other formats. So it helps a lot to use the appropriate headings, to use the appropriate title types. That makes a big difference. So definitely keep those sort of things in mind. This is the sort of thing that we want to have in all these different guides and make it accessible as much as we can. And it's going to be difficult to cover every format. So we expect there to be more things that folks come up with questions about. And that's something we'd like you to reach out with. And we can definitely tackle that as those come up. And I think, yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
We had some feedback, so not a question, but just so that you are aware, very much appreciate the information about the accessibility tools. It is easy to do a quick self-check before needing to ask for more help in HTML versus PDF, which is such a great recommendation since PDFs are very difficult to read on cell phones. So that was just like a little kudos. Thank you. Audrey says for Chrome, if you need it, in the top right menu, click on More Tools and then Developer Tools, and you'll see Lighthouse in the list.
Yes, good
Is that
call out on that. Absolutely. Yeah,
so? That's
I
not
kind of
just
jumped
if
to.
you added it as an extension, but you'll just see it by default. Is that correct?
Yeah. So if you go up here to the little ellipsis button in the top right of Chrome, I know it's probably really tiny. My apologies. If I can try to blow it up a little bit more, it's not going to blow up the menu, unfortunately. If you click on that, right near the bottom, there's more tools and then developer tools. And the other way that I often get to it, and I sort of will shortcut to it without thinking about it, just because I've done it too many times at this point, is sometimes if I right click anywhere on the page and say inspect, that's another way you can jump to it as well. And to that highlight, yeah, those instructions are perfect, because right over here near the top in these little tabs in this bottom bar, Lighthouse is right there. Now, Lighthouse uses the same, for those that may be familiar with this already, that maybe use Axe, A-X-E, that is the same engine. So if you're using Axe DevTools, that's also a great way to consider it as well. It's also the tool that's used by the DQ Enterprise tool. So again, all these different enterprise tools have a lot of relation to different tools that are out there. So a good way you can kind of take a look and check on things.
Perfect. And I've been adding links along the way, Al. You can check the chat after, but just as you kind of mentioned things, I've been trying to put them in the chat for everyone. I also just added a link to the Center for UX has a web page on developing accessible websites, which has a lot of great links, as well as a web page on how to write effective alt text. That was something that Al mentioned earlier, was adding alt text to your images. So just showing a link for guidance on how to write that alt text.
Absolutely. And I can jump into that guide as well, just for those that haven't seen these before. These live in it.wisc. And if you take a look there, the current guides, again, are still very relevant. We just would like to update them soon to make sure that there's a little bit more ease of information and additional details that we just didn't have before. So one of the things that, I think this group is very technology savvy, of course, so it doesn't necessarily pertain as much here. But we have broken out in the new guides coming soon, a fundamentals guide as well. So if you have any fellow colleagues that are maybe consider this current information overwhelming or too technical, the intention there is that fundamentals guide, which will come with a downloadable checklist for anybody in that space, is just really good basics for everything you might be working on. Just the things you should follow, as I mentioned, of things around heading structure and lists and that sort of things. Those sort of things go a long way. Even if you never run a scanner and never check for certain things like that, that really does help quite a bit.
And there was also just a thank you from Ketter Al for presenting on this topic. She had to leave, but she wanted you to know.
Oh, I appreciate that. Thanks, Ketter. Yeah. There's a lot more that we can get into this space. So if folks are looking to learn a little bit more or hearing about some of the work going on here, always happy to share it. But I do really appreciate all the time that you've given me today to come talk to all of you. So this has been great.
Super helpful. Thank you, Al. Other questions that you might have, feel free to throw them in the chat or unmute. This is an interesting question that Tiffany just posed. As long as we're using WiscWeb, are we okay for now? Um, I,
It means
guess,
you're in a
yeah.
good spot. Yeah,
Yeah,
Jenna, would you like to
it's
answer this
sort of
one?
nuanced. Yeah, I think what Al was touching on earlier is that we use the UW theme as our only theme in WiscWeb, and that from the start is really accessible, which is great. So you're starting at a really good point. We also really work hard to make sure that other tooling that we use is accessible. So we work closely with the Center for UX on evaluations of things like our plugins so that we understand the barriers that exist, document them in the KB, the knowledge base documentation, and work with the vendors if there's any barriers found so that those can be remedied. That said, that doesn't mean that things don't exist. And there are definitely ways that there could be accessibility barriers within your content. Those are things that you have more control over. So great things that Al mentioned was like adding alt text to your images. But there's other things that you can do as well within your pages. So I think the big thing is like there's some great scanning tools where you can get a better understanding. You're likely in a decent place, but it's definitely recommended, I think, to kind of be a little bit proactive about it and try to dig in and see where you might be able to improve it further.
Yeah, absolutely. There's always an opportunity within the content to kind of forget a piece here or there. So there might be small issues that can be created that way. But typically, as long as you're on a platform that's managed and that team, I know that a bunch of teams, Cal's I know from my work there and calling up Mark here, I know does a lot of great work now in that space. Having Jason Lemieux and Extension and others that do a lot of this work, for those that have a platform like that, if you have a team that sort of manages your WordPress instance like that, always good to get in touch with them. And as well, we work with them as well, but just to kind of, if you have questions about some of those things. But yeah, those sort of spots definitely put you in a better position for sure. If you're in a situation where you're creating something from scratch, or if you're doing a full web application, there's a lot more you might have to consider. And that's something that we would want to, we certainly help to, if you're trying to figure out and identify maybe any blind spots, that sort of thing. That's the kind of thing that we always recommend reaching out. We're always happy to help do an eval and sort of give you a sense of it. And I don't want those to sound, like scary or anything. They're really just internal. They're meant for you to understand more of what you might be able to do more. These sort of things. This is about, just trying to get folks more aware of what improvements they can make.
Yeah, and that's a great example of where we partner with the Center for UX, which is when they run those evals of WiscWeb sites, if there is anything that is something that is not maybe content specific, but more so related to the theme or something that we can control, that information is shared with us, and we do try to prioritize that work in our like development cycles. A great example is Maria from the center recently found a barrier with the fact staff placeholder image where it didn't have alt text. So Maria notified us, and we were able to get that into the next UW theme update so that we remove that barrier for folks. Um, James has another note there that just says super presentation. I think we all have to face new challenges in addressing dynamic content, especially around data presentation. It may be a good practice to provide alt text around any page objects to describe the intent of an object and what the object contains and how changed. This could be a boilerplate stub, perhaps.
Yeah, I think, if I think when in doubt, having more description, not less, right, is a really is a good rule of practice to follow. So having there's been examples for those that have done a lot of work in the space maybe before. You'll hear about the phrase of decorative images, and decorative images are, a it's sort of there are cases for them. There are still instances where you really might have something that's extremely um, unrelevant to it's just irrelevant to the content. There's nothing it's helping or supporting. Maybe it's just providing a borderline or something to that effect. But there's a lot of images I think that fall into this gray area where folks may lean on that being a decorative image, and in reality, it probably should benefit from some amount of alt text. So if there's a text that has content around it, and the content around it is really the text, let's say, around it is really the most important thing. You might think that that image is then more or less irrelevant. The text is around the paragraphs that precede it, let's say, are taking care of it. But the thing you have to keep in mind is that, everyone's experience might be different, and that there is going to be individuals that, for example, may not have full vision impairment. They may just have partial, and they know there's an image there. They just can't make it out. So to them, it can be frustrating because they see an image there. They don't know that that text may be describing that appropriately. So yeah, leaning towards, having things described more often than not is definitely a better approach.
Other questions?
Well, if there's no other major questions as well, I do appreciate everyone's time, and definitely feel free to reach out. There's a lot of great work that's being done here by a lot of people I know already in this room. So my hat is off to all of you that do this. And even for those that are just getting into it, this is a great space.
Thank you. And hats off to you as well, Al. We really appreciate this info. So helpful. You're getting a lot of
Yeah.
good kudos in the chat.
Yeah. Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you. When you said hats off, I definitely pictured um, the Iron Man helmet.
Yeah. Right. We're gonna go all the way back
Stay
to
on
that.
theme.
Hats off. It's like
Full
full
circle.
helmet, full
Yeah.
assembly. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we'll wrap it there. I'm going to stop the recording.